Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, and still I rise. And I rise today as a part of this month wherein we will honor women. This is Women's History Month. But I'm going to do something that is a little unusual and apologize for the encroachment upon Women's History Month that I shall engage in today. It's an encroachment because I want to extend Black History Month by one day. And I do so because actually, in reality, Black history should be an everyday event. So to the women of the world, my apologies. One day of encroachment as I speak about Black history. And of course, I rise, Madam Speaker, as a proud descendant of the enslaved people who built America, made America the great country it is, the foundational mothers and fathers. Yes, there were others here who did work, but they did it for hundreds of years without remuneration. So I rise to honor them during this Black History Month. I rise because it is necessary and proper that we put Black history in its proper perspective, that the story be truthfully told about the history of Africans in America, because it hasn't. And the truth is, we say that Black history is American history, and I agree it is. But the truth is, Black history is world history. It's bigger than the United States of America. It's global in scope. Today, however, I shall focus on Black history as it relates to the United States of America. And I do believe that it is important for us to give a little bit of history on Black History Month itself. The precursor to Black History Month was Negro History Week. This was during the second week in February, started in 1926 by the Honorable Historian Carter G. Woodson, in concert with the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, the ASALH. Dear friends, this organization has endorsed this year's Black History resolution that we have. This organization is one that I'm proud to associate with for guidance and instruction. I would add that Negro History Week was founded on this week, the week that I called to your attention in that relates to Black history, and coincided with the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. Black History Month was first proposed by Black educators and the Black United Students at Kent State University in February of 1969. The first celebration took place at Kent State a year later in 1970. This year's theme for Black history is Black Resistance. The theme explores how African Americans have resisted historic and ongoing oppression. My original Black History resolution has passed this House 4 times. First, May 12th of 2007, wherein it was agreed upon by a voice vote. Again, May 6, 2008, where it received 367 yeas, no nays, 62 persons not voting. And a third time on February 24th of 2009, where we had 420 yeas, no nays, and 12 not voting. The final time that it actually passed the House was on February the 23rd of 2010, with 402 yeas, no nays, and 30 not voting. Since then, we have not been recording votes for resolutions, generally speaking, which is why we don't get a vote on Black History Month resolutions now. But I'm proud to tell you that for this resolution this year, we have 104 co-sponsors. And I'm proud to tell you that this resolution has been approved by the organization that has been sponsoring this month for many years now. associated with Carter G. Woodson. Please allow me to read some excerpts from this year's resolution. Whereas this resolution may be cited as the original Black History Month resolution of 2023. Whereas this resolution has been endorsed by the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Whereas the theme for Black History Month 2023 is Black Resistance, which coincides and chronicles how African Americans have resisted oppression in all its invidious forms, including enslavement, lynching, mob violence, police brutality, black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow laws, lawful segregation, and invidious discrimination. Whereas slavery was a brutal and inhumane system that treated human beings as property and stripped them of their inalienable human rights of liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness. Whereas the history of Black resistance in the United States predates the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s, as it historically spans centuries from colonial slavery through contemporary invidious discrimination. Whereas this resolution illuminates some of the momentous recondite history of Black resistance that predates the resistance movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. Whereas Black resistance to slavery was a constant, persistent, and it was persistent throughout the history of enslavement in the United States. And it took many forms, including the acts of rebellion, escape, some persons committed suicide, sabotage, litigation, work slowdowns, persons would feign illness, misplacing or damaging tools. People would literally do anything that they could in the form of noncompliance to resist their being enslaved. Whereas there's historical evidence of as many as 250 instances of slave revolts involving 10 or more slaves during the history of American slavery. Whereas Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser rebellions were two of the most significant acts of armed resistance to slavery in the United States, inspiring other enslaved people to resist and making it clear that the determination of enslaved people to fight for their freedom was something that would be persisted with. Whereas Gabriel Prosser's rebellion against Virginia in the United States in 1800s was a landmark event in the history of Black resistance to slavery in the United States. And although he and his followers were hanged, his bravery and leadership continued to inspire generations of activists and advocates. Whereas the Stono Rebellion, the New York City conspiracy, and the German Coast Uprising are other instances of significant slave uprisings in the United States and its predecessor colonies. Whereas in the fight for freedom, liberty, justice, and equality, the righteous resistance of many Black freedom fighters has been depreciated, downplayed, deprecated, disparaged, denigrated, disrespected, and demonized. Whereas one such instance of depreciation and an effort to minimize the history of such a person is that of Claudette Colvin, who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus months before the incident wherein Rosa Parks refused to do the same thing. But one person was depreciated and disrespected. The other has been noted in history as a historic and heroic person. Whereas Bayard Rustin, a lifelong civil rights advocate and lead organizer of the March on Washington, was nearly written out of history merely because of his sexual orientation. Whereas religion was a form of resistance to slavery, as it allowed the enslaved to assert their humanity, dignity, and independence. Whereas spiritual songs often used as a form of resistance by building community and maintaining good spirits as a means of healing and even communicating secret messages. Whereas the song Steal Away was used by Nat Turner to call people to him to discuss plans for his rebellion. And the same song was also sung by slaves who planned on escaping at some time that was in their immediate future. Whereas the song Get on the Gospel Train provided courage for slaves to escape, citing room for many people, a train available to everyone, and a promise that also alluded to the fact that both blacks and whites provided assistance to fugitive slaves as they traveled the Underground Railroad. Whereas the song Sweet Chariot was said to be a personal favorite of Harriet Tubman's, as it indicated to slaves that they would be escaping soon. Whereas the song Follow the Drinking Gourd was used to remind slaves of the clues they would need to find their way to the north. Whereas those slaves who resisted their enslavement by running away were not only recaptured, punished, and returned to their torment, but also exposed to newspaper ads which assured enslavers that all was well. Whereas the following is a selection of ads on captured, suspected fugitive slaves that ran in the Montgomery Advertiser from 1849 to 1865. One such ad. Whereas John, 23, ran away from Levi Williams and had a $25 reward offer for John's return. Remember, these are newspaper ads indicating that all is well because the slaves are being captured. Whereas George, 20, was captured in Mobile County after he escaped from owner James Edward Wilson in Memphis, Tennessee. Whereas Hannah, arrested in Pickens County, was a 75-year-old woman who was said to belong to John Smith of Lowes County, Mississippi. Whereas Frank, whose age was described only as a boy, was an at-large runaway with a $15 reward for his capture. Whereas Lucinda, 20, was jailed in Mobile County, Alabama, belonged to Miss Elizabeth Hensley of Sumter County, Alabama, and had multiple scars on her right arm. Remember, these are ads indicating that all is well because blacks who attempt to escape are being captured. Whereas black resistance to slavery was confronted with harsh court decisions that stripped blacks of their human rights. Whereas in the 1857 Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, the Supreme Court ruled that having lived in a free state and territory did not entitle an enslaved person, Dred Scott, to his freedom. Whereas the court further in Dred Scott versus Sanford indicated that people of African descent are not and were not intended to be included under the word citizen in the United States Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which that instrument provides and secures to citizens of the United States. Whereas in Dred Scott versus Sanford, Chief Justice Roger Taney declared in the Supreme Court's infamous majority opinion that Dred Scott, a black slave, had no rights a white man was bound to respect. Whereas the Supreme Court in 1896 in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson embraced legal segregation, which advanced constitutional justification for laws that allowed the separate and supposedly equal public facilities for white and black Americans. Whereas the Underground Railroad, led by fugitives such as Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, played a vital role in the resistance by helping enslaved people escape to freedom. Whereas during the Civil War, black soldiers made up approximately 10% of the Union Army, with approximately 180,000 black soldiers enlisting to fight for their freedom and the abolition of slavery. Whereas despite facing discrimination and being paid less than white soldiers, black soldiers played a crucial role in the Union's victory in the Civil War by risking and, in many instances, too many instances, sacrificing their lives in the fight for the freedom of their fellow men and women. Whereas the black soldiers participated in the Civil War was not only significant in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the impact their participation had on the fight for racial equality and civil rights, as it challenged the notion that black Americans were not capable of fighting for their own freedom. Whereas the Civil War, as well as the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, emanated from black resistance to slavery in the United States. Whereas the abolition of slavery did not end white supremacy. Whereas the period between the end of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement was marked by continued discrimination and oppression of African Americans, despite the abolition of slavery. Whereas the history of black resistance in the United States has demonstrated that the fight for racial justice and equity is ongoing and multifaceted, and that despite the massive strides that have been made in the name of justice, there are still many areas where progress is needed. Whereas black activists in the United States have inspired many other marginalized communities around the world to fight for their rights and their equality. Whereas the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass inspired the creation of Negro History Week, the precursor to Black History Month, and whereas the month of February is officially celebrated as Black History Month, which dates to 1926 when Carter G. Woodson set aside the second week in February as Negro History Week to recognize the history and achievement of black Americans. Now, therefore, be it resolved that this resolution may be cited as the original Black History Month resolution of 1923, recognizing and celebrating the significance of Black History Month. The House of Representatives recognizes the importance of commemorating Black History Month as it acknowledges achievements of black Americans throughout the nation's history and encourages the continuation of its celebration to raise the awareness of this community's accomplishments for all Americans. Dear friends, this month that we just had the opportunity to recognize as Black History Month, February, this month is one that we ought to do more than simply talk about the history of black people in the Americas. The history is something that honestly has been overlooked and has been underrepresented. It truly has been disrespected. And we have to talk about it. It is important. But we've got to do more than talk about it. We in this Congress must do that which we can do to demonstrate that we have respect for black history. It's one thing to talk about the wonderful things that have been done, but it's an entirely different thing to show that we respect black history. Yes, having the resolution presented on the floor of the Congress is one way of demonstrating respect, but that's not enough. Black history has to be respected in the sense that the people who were a part of that history are respected. And to this day, we have not shown respect for the black people who are the foundational mothers and fathers of this country. We've not shown respect for the hands, the humble hands, that helped construct the Capitol building that I stand in, that helped to construct the White House, the humble hands that planted the seeds, harvested the crops, fed the nation, the humble hands that built the roads and the bridges, that laid the foundation for America's bright future that it celebrates and has to this day. The black people who made America the great country it is have not been properly appreciated and respected. Yes, we should have a Black History Month. And yes, we will continue to show these resolutions and to appreciate what happened. But we have to respect the people. In this country, we have shown more respect for the enslavers than the enslaved. In this country, we have shown respect for the Confederate enslavers and disrespected the enslaved. You disrespect the enslaved when you show respect for those who would enslave them. That act in and of itself is disrespect. Every statue in every city of Confederate soldiers is a way of disrespecting the people that were enslaved. It's time to honor and respect those who were enslaved in this country. And to do that, to honor them and to respect them, the least we can do is what we have done for the Confederate soldiers. In this country, in 1956, we passed a resolution in the House of Representatives to give to the Confederate soldiers a Congressional Gold Medal. No such honor has been bestowed upon the foundational mothers and fathers, the enslaved people who laid the foundation for America's greatness. No such honor. If we can accord the highest medal that the Congress can award to Confederate soldiers, surely we can appreciate and respect the enslaved persons who helped make America the great country it is today. We ought to, this Congress ought to, Democrats and Republicans ought to vote to accord a Congressional Gold Medal to the enslaved people who helped make America great. The people who suffered one of the greatest crimes ever committed against humanity. Enslaved for centuries in this country. We ought to show them some respect. We ought to accord them a Congressional Gold Medal. We must do for them what we did for the Confederate soldiers. We should not revere the enslavers and revile the enslaved. It's time to respect the foundational mothers and fathers of this country. And I intend to ask all of my colleagues, by way of a piece of legislation that we filed on the last day of Black History Month, with intentionality. We wanted to give the entire month for persons to become original co-sponsors of this resolution. It is a resolution that would call for a Congressional Gold Medal being presented to the foundational mothers and fathers of the country. I said resolution is actually a piece of legislation. It would have to pass the House and pass the Senate. I believe it can be done. I know that this, to some people, is unacceptable. I understand that there are many people who won't find favor with what I'm saying, but I challenge anybody to defy the truth in what I say. Defy the truth. The truth is that we have disrespected the enslaved. The truth is we have lionized the enslavers. That has to change. Posterity has to receive a positive message about the people who built this country. This is that positive message. This message is one that will say to posterity that we want you to know that we have respect for the enslaved people who suffered their entire lives, many of them, from birth to death. The enslaved people babies born into slavery, grew up in slavery, lived and died in slavery. Respect for their lives and the suffering and the sacrifice. They should be respected. And the truth is, we have not. So I want my friends to know that this piece of legislation would allow us to present this Congressional Gold Medal. The president would sign the legislation. I believe this president will sign it. There are some who wouldn't. President Joe Biden is not one of them. I would stake my life on it. I stake my life. If this passes the House and the Senate, I would put my life on the notion that he will sign it. I believe he will. My prayer is that the House and the Senate will have the courage to do not just the right thing and pass this, but to do the righteous thing. The righteous thing. To show now, some hundreds of years later, the respect that we should have shown hundreds of years before to the enslaved people who worked, lived, and died without remuneration. The enslaved people also, I might add, who were demeaned. And probably one of the greatest insults ever was that many people called them lazy. Many of the people who were doing this, mind you, were owners of slaves. Now, you're a slave owner. You're working people for nothing, at no cost to you other than you have to maintain your property as you see it. But you would call them lazy because they don't work hard enough. Lazy, free labor, lazy, built the Capitol, White House, roads, bridges, planted the crops, harvested the crops, lazy, at no cost. What an insult. What an insult. Here's the opportunity for us to show the respect. The respect that they, through the window of the centuries, we should pass back to them and let them know that we appreciate them. If we do this, America the beautiful will be a more beautiful America. If we do this, history will reward us with a better image of our self, in the sense that we will be shown as people who will recognize a transgression and do all that we can to correct it, even hundreds of years later. And the least we can do is show respect for the enslaved people who built America and helped to make it the great country it is. I am proud to be a descendant of the enslaved people who built this country, who helped to make it the place that I love and a place that I defend. And I do love my country. I like to close with this because I want no one to assume that because I want justice and because I want righteousness to prevail, that I don't love the country. I wear the flag. I salute the flag. I sing the national anthem. I stand for it. I'm that guy who loves his country. But my saluting the flag and singing the national anthem is almost inconsequential Because you see, the question is, will I defend the person who does not salute the flag, who does not sing the national anthem, who won't stand for it but will take a knee? Will I defend that person? The greatness of America lies in our ability to defend those who don't salute the flag. That's the greatness. The greatness is not in Al Green placing his hand over his heart and saying the pledge. I do it, but that's not the greatness. The greatness is in recognizing that in this country, you have the freedom to salute or not. So I love the country. I'm going to fight to defend the country. But just as I loved my family and my mother and father, they loved me. When I was wrong, there were consequences. We have to correct wrong. We have to right the injustice. And I stand here today to say, as a proud American, I want to right the wrong, correct the injustice, accord a Congressional Gold Medal to the enslaved, foundational mothers and fathers of this country. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.